next session, we will take a further step back and look at strategies, different strategies in the times of rising needs for raw materials. And for that, I'd like to welcome Greg de Temmerman onto the stage. Good afternoon. Is it working?
I hope it does, yes.
Yes, great. If you could hold
Sure.
it very close. Exactly. Thank you. You are Head of Science at the Quadrature Climate Foundation. Thank you for being here, coming here from London, right?
Yes, yes.
Exactly. So we are in the midst of a transition towards a much greener economy across the world. How much will this increase our needs for raw materials, and what will we have to do to satisfy those needs?
Okay, so first it's important to remember what the energy transition is all about. The energy transition is about going from a fossil fuel-based system where we keep extracting things, burning them, and putting the waste into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
We are going to a system which is going to be more metal-intensive, but one has to check how much fossil fuels we are extracting right now and how much metals we need in the future. Right now, we are consuming about 15 billion tons of coal, oil, and gas every year. 8 billion tons per year just for coal that we are burning, right? So if you look at how much extraction you need for the energy transition, mainly metals, in fact, the total material requirement is actually slightly decreasing because we do move a lot of rocks when we try to get to coal. So one has to be careful about that. We will need more metals, but less extraction in total, which is quite interesting. The second thing which is interesting is that when you burn fossil fuels, you basically burn your resource, so it disappears because you burn something which has been accumulating for millions of years. And then you put the waste into the atmosphere, and that changes the climate. Now, if you have metals, you can, in principle, recycle them. So you have the issue of scaling up the production very quickly because you are transitioning very quickly. But you can recycle at really high rate at some point, not 100%, but if you can reach 80, 90%, then you decrease the need for the material.
Okay, and I understand that different countries have different strategies when it comes to that?
So one thing to understand is, in many cases, for the many metals that we need to increase the production extremely quickly. And the mining industry is an industry which is really slow to move because it takes up to 15 years to open a new mine once you have found some metals. So we are racing towards net zero, not fast enough, unfortunately, but at the same time, we need to move an industry which is well established and which is extremely slow to react because this is not a very elastic industry. So there is a kind of a mismatch between the urgency at which we need to change the energy system and the speed at which we can actually get those metals. The second thing is that you are changing the geopolitics because you use a lot of coal and oil right now that we are not going to use in the future. Metals are not produced in the same countries that oil is produced in most cases. So that you do change the geopolitics there. You also do change the number of countries you are dealing with. In many cases, if you think the oil market is tight or is controlled by a few countries, metals, in many cases, you have 4, 5, 6 countries which are producing. So you are really strongly dependent on different countries. And that's where we define what is called the criticality. So criticality for metals means how resilient is your supply chain and how dependent are you on a given metal for a given technology. So the race of different countries now is to try to securize or secure their supply chains and try to make sure we have agreements on both getting the raw material but also the refined products, because what you want is not the ore that you are digging out. What you want is copper, what you want is lithium, what you want is all those kind of things. And we know, for example, in the case of rare earth, which you need for magnets in some wind turbines technology, 60%, 70% of the refining is in China. So you are very strongly dependent on one country, and we know that the geopolitics right now is complicated. So the question is, can you secure your supply chains? Can you start exploiting your own resources? Because we do have resources in Europe that we could use, which means you kind of diversify a bit your portfolio. Can we have refining capacity so that we have the capacity to produce those metals ourselves? And can we also recycle much more, because then we need less actually at some point.
I mean, it's going to be rather tricky, right, for Europe to refine all this, to get access to all these materials. I remember, for example, in Portugal, there's a big discussion about getting all the lithium out of the soil.
It's going to be challenging on for a lot of reasons. First one is because in Europe, nobody wants to see a mine next to his backyard. That's a big issue. It's also a question of investing a lot of money into mining, into refining, because we have used different kind of supply chains. But this is something you probably can't get around because you need those metals to build all the technologies you need. Unless you think it's better to use the market, but in some cases, in cases of crisis, when you are dependent on other countries and possibly on shortage of some components or metals, and that means you are slowing down your own transition. So it's kind of a complicated balance between how much you want to be secure because you want to go fast in deploying those technologies, and how you want to control everything because at some point some things might happen in the future where climate is becoming more uncertain, and we know there will be more conflicts because of that.
What about the Russian invasion in Ukraine? Has that made things worse? Since then, obviously, lots of people are talking about scarcity of certain materials.
If we look at the global energy market, one thing we can see is that the Russian invasion in Ukraine has basically accelerated the trend. So most countries, especially in Europe, have understood that energy security was a big concern. This is something we didn't talk about in the last few years. We forgot about energy resilience and supply. And now we know that there is a big incentive to not be dependent on other countries anymore. And that's what renewables allow you to do. You are basically producing your own electricity, at least, and part of your energy. So most countries are trying to accelerate as fast as possible. And we have seen the amount of investment going strongly up after the Russian crisis. Some people were wondering, would it slow down things? Would it accelerate? It looks like we are on a very strongly accelerating curve. The International Energy Agency, a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I think, just upped their estimates for renewable installation in 2023 that they had released in December. So 4 months later, they basically increased their estimates of how much we are going to install by 23%, which is quite incredible. That means really we are going faster than whatever people could think of a couple of years ago.
But has that conflict cut us off from certain markets we had access to beforehand and which we needed?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Has the fact that Russia has invaded Ukraine and that has shaken up international relations, has that cut Europe or the US off from certain markets we had access to beforehand regarding raw materials?
Not so much. Metals haven't been so concerned by sanctions so far. Russia is a big player on some of them, but not so many, so there were ways to go around. So we haven't seen a big effect on the supply chains in terms of metals. What we have seen is tension because people want more metals, and again, the supply is basically not following the demand. So this is a question of really, can you increase the supply as fast as the demand is increasing, or even faster? And that is something where we start to see a lot of tensions on lithium and copper or things like that. This is going to be exacerbated in the next few years because we'll need much more copper. Copper is if you have to bet on one metal which is really going to be the bottleneck for the energy transition, it's not lithium or anything like that, it's copper. Copper is a very old industry. We have been using copper for 200 years, yet we have to double the production capacity of copper in the next 20, 30 years, which is quite incredible given the number of mines we already have. So this is probably going to be the biggest challenge in the energy transition is just copper, because we need that for wires, for electrical conduction, and for electric motors and so on.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your insight. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.